performance at the St. Giles Amateur Theatre had drawn a modest but enthusiastic crowd from the surrounding village of Lower Hambledon. The evening was to feature the final act of The Vicar's Mistake, a light comedy starring a rotation of local talent and produced by the church committee. The audience filled the small velvet-seated hall, unaware that tonight's performance would end in something far more chilling than a comedic misunderstanding. At precisely 9:08 p.m., during the final scene of the second act, a loud clattering snap echoed through the auditorium. The velvet stage curtain, long and heavy with age, dropped abruptly, cutting the performance short and drawing gasps from the crowd. For a moment, the noise was dismissed as a prop malfunction or an over-eager cue. But the lights stayed dim, and no actor stepped forward to address the confusion. Then came a woman's scream. It wasn't part of the play. Behind the fallen curtain, sprawled at centre stage, lay the body of Edmund Swan, a retired barrister and well-respected chairman of the parish council. His chest was still, arms awkwardly outstretched, and the blood at his temple glistened beneath the footlights. No one had heard a gunshot or any sound that would suggest a struggle. Only that sudden crash and the curtain's descent. The first to the scene was Alice Harmon, the production's director, who stumbled back with a pale face and a hand over her mouth. Others followed: the vicar, two of the younger actors, and, finally, Constable Reeves, summoned from the vestibule by the theatre's caretaker. The curtain rope had not broken. It had been cut, cleanly, deliberately, and the cut had been made from above, on the catwalk that ran across the stage ceiling, accessible only by a narrow locked stairwell. The actors had been in the wings, waiting for their final cues. No one claimed to have heard or seen anything unusual. No one, they insisted, had gone near the stairwell. The locked door at its base had been secured since intermission. What puzzled the local constable most was the timing. Edmund Swan had not been part of the production. He was seated in the front row during the first act. No one saw him move backstage. No announcement was made, and yet, at the very moment the curtain fell, he was behind it, alone, unconscious, and dying. The coroner would later confirm the injury to his head was the cause of death. Blunt force trauma, a single, fatal blow. But with what? The area around the body was clean, no brick, no pipe, no heavy object in sight. The only oddity, if it could be called that, was a small wooden mask lying just beside his open palm. Painted red with streaks of silver, it resembled something from a carnival. No one could identify it. Word of the strange death spread quickly through the village, and with it no shortage of speculation. Poisoning. Fainting followed by an accidental fall. A lover's quarrel turned deadly. But no one could explain how. Edmund had ended up backstage, nor why the curtain had dropped at that precise moment, nor what the mask meant. It was on the third morning, after the inquest had been opened and recessed due to lack of clear evidence, that Miss Marple arrived. Invited by her old friend, Mrs. Lavinia Tuck, a widow who volunteered for the theatre's costume department. "I simply don't understand it, Jane," Lavinia had said in her letter. "Everything was so ordinary, and then it wasn't. I feel something is off, something no one else sees." Miss Marple sat quietly in the front row during the theatre's closure, watching the crew dismantle the set. She observed how the curtain ropes ran through pulleys into the rigging above. She studied the layout of the wings, the angle of the footlights, and the narrow corridor leading behind the stage. She asked about Mr. Swan's role in the community, his recent disagreements, and his peculiar decision to attend both rehearsals and opening night, despite never showing interest in theatre before. She took particular note when someone mentioned that Mr. Swan had brought a guest with him during rehearsals, a distant cousin visiting from abroad. No one could remember the cousin's name. Some even doubted he existed. No ticket record. No introduction. Just the vague recollection of a tall man in a dark coat, seen once lingering near the prop table and never again. The mask found near the body remained unexplained. The theatre troupe swore it wasn't part of any costume. The props manager insisted it had never been used in any prior play. Lavinia, however, remembered something else. A memory from years ago when the village fair had hired a troupe of travelling performers, jugglers, mimics, dancers, one of whom wore a mask nearly identical to the one now resting in the police evidence locker. Miss Marple began to consider the possibility that the crime wasn't about the theatre at all, that the stage had simply been the setting chosen for a performance of a different kind, one meant not for an audience, but to disguise a carefully executed plan. A plan, perhaps, that had begun long before the curtain ever rose. What remained, maddeningly unclear, was timing. If Swan had gone backstage willingly, why had no one seen him? If he'd been lured, how was it arranged without a trace? And if he'd been struck, where was the weapon? Miss Marple walked to the edge of the stage, asking politely for the lights to be turned off. In the gloom, she stared at the gap between curtain and floor. A slim, narrow space. Then she looked toward the catwalk above. The angle was tight, but, perhaps just barely, a heavy object could be dropped from above, tethered to the same rope used to rig the curtain. A staged accident, but not quite. When she finally requested to see the backstage storage beneath the stage floor, Lavinia took her down a short flight of creaky stairs to a cramped chamber filled with props, rolled carpet, and disused wooden crates. Miss Marple scanned the space until her eyes settled on a thick coil of curtain rope, a fresh cut, frayed ends, just like the one above. But this one was stained faintly at the knot. Not with blood, but with red paint, the same red as the mask. Her gaze sharpened. Something told her that whatever had struck Edmund Swan had not been thrown. It had dropped, precisely timed, precisely weighted, and precisely painted, so as not to reveal its true purpose until it had already disappeared into the darkness of the prop room below. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves and for the first time allowed herself a faint smile. The performance, it seemed, had not gone quite as the killer intended, but the final act was yet to be written. Miss Marple remained by the stage edge as the low hum of idle conversation drifted from the theatre's lobby. The police had done their rounds again that morning, tapping clipboards and reiterating their statements to the theatre staff. They asked about the locked stairwell, the rope's frayed end, the absence of a murder weapon. But to Miss Marple, those were no longer the central questions. What concerned her more was something smaller, more human, the oddness in people's reactions. Not what they said, but how they said it. She returned to the auditorium, empty now except for a young man rearranging chairs. His jacket was carelessly buttoned, and he hummed a popular tune under his breath. Miss Marple had seen him the night of the performance. Peter Cresswell, one of the minor actors, always in the background, mostly delivering props or serving drinks in crowd scenes. She approached him gently, asking whether he'd ever seen the red mask before the night of the accident. Peter hesitated, not in confusion, but in calculation. "Can't say I have, ma'am," he said. Looked like something from an old circus, though. Didn't seem to belong. She nodded politely and let him return to his work, but her mind caught on one word: seemed. An odd choice if he truly had no prior familiarity. He hadn't said looked like or appeared to be, but seemed suggesting a thought process he was reluctant to admit. Miss Marple made a note to ask Lavinia later if Peter had ever travelled outside the village. As she stepped into the dressing-room corridors, she met Constable Reeves coming out of the prop storage. His brow was furrowed in that familiar expression of honest frustration. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Can't say we're any closer to understanding this thing. No prints, no missing items reported. We've questioned all the actors twice. If it was foul play, it's a clever one." "I'm sure it is," she replied softly. "Tell me, have you asked the lighting technician whether he noticed any unusual weight or shift in the pulleys that night?" Reeves blinked. "Weight?" She gestured upward. "A heavy object dropped with enough force to kill a man would cause imbalance on the rigging. Perhaps a pulley moved too sharply. Perhaps a rope strained differently than expected. Such things don't often go unnoticed by people who work in precision." Reeves nodded slowly, making a note. "I'll check with him. Also," she added, "you might ask whether anyone borrowed a tool, perhaps a wrench or mallet, before or after rehearsal. Something not dangerous on its own, but heavy enough when fastened to a rope." She left him to it, walking through the narrow corridor behind the stage. The air smelled faintly of must and paint. She paused at a wall-mounted bulletin board, covered, with rehearsal schedules, costume fittings, and handwritten notes. One pinned sheet caught her eye. Not for what it said, but what it didn't. A costume list had been meticulously filled out for every actor except one, Edmund Swan. Odd, since he had no role in the play. Stranger still, his name had been written. At the top corner of the list in faded pencil, then rubbed out, but not entirely. A faint schwa still lingered beside an empty line. Miss Marple leaned closer, studying the paper's worn edge. Who had started to include him in the costuming, and then thought better of it? She continued toward the green room, where Lavinia was sorting through a box of discarded accessories. Scarves, hats, gloves, none of them likely relevant. Still, Miss Marple asked if any had gone missing. "Well," Lavinia said, pulling off her glasses. "There was an old red sash I was using to tie one of the props. Went missing 2 nights before the show. I thought someone reused it for their costume. Haven't seen it since." "Did the sash have any markings?" "It had silver embroidery at the ends, swirled, like carnival patterns." "Why?" Miss Marple didn't answer. She walked slowly toward the far end of the green room, where a coat rack still held leftover pieces from the performance. Most were frayed or stained, but among them hung a charcoal-grey overcoat, not part of any character's wardrobe. She touched the fabric. It was finer than the others. No costume tag, no mothball scent. And in its pocket, folded carefully and tucked away, was a train ticket from Brighton to Lower Hambledon, dated 2 days before the performance. No name. But the seat number, D4, matched one of the unclaimed tickets the theatre had reserved for late guests. She turned toward Lavinia. "Who picked up this coat on closing night?" "No one," Lavinia said. "We assumed it belonged to a patron who'd left early in the confusion, or someone who never meant to be noticed." It was then that Miss Marple saw it, barely visible behind the coat stand, half wedged into the skirting board, a glint of metal. She knelt and retrieved it carefully. a tiny fragment of curved bronze. Not quite a hook, not quite a clasp, but weighted at the end. It smelled faintly of oil, possibly from rigging, possibly from a prop. She held it up to the light. Lavinia stepped closer. "That doesn't look like anything from the show." "No," Miss Marple murmured, "but it looks like something that would make a perfect counterweight if tied to the right object and swung from above. Something that wouldn't draw attention unless you knew exactly what to look for." Before she could continue, a voice called from the doorway. It was Peter again, peering in with a polite, too-practiced smile. "Sorry to interrupt, but someone said you were asking about missing tools." Miss Marple smiled calmly. "Just following up. Did you borrow anything recently?" He paused a little too long. "No, not me. But Clive, you know, the man who runs lighting, he lent someone a spanner last week. Didn't say who." Miss Marple nodded, but she wasn't watching Peter's face. She was watching his hands. One was bandaged at the knuckles, tight and recent. He followed her gaze, then tucked it quickly behind his back. "Caught it on a nail backstage," he said with a practiced shrug. "Of course," Miss Marple replied, but she knew then what she had suspected all along. Someone had planned the act with care, stage timing, weapon, escape, and in doing so made one small error, not in the mechanics, but in the theatre's most human detail, the habit of actors to stay in character even when they think no one is watching. And Peter Cresswell, it seemed, had been acting too long without a script. Miss Marple remained seated in the green room after Peter left, eyes still on the doorway, mind quietly collecting threads. She had long believed that deception often came not from silence but from over-explanation, from those who filled in their stories too quickly, too cleanly. The boy had offered help without being asked, volunteered information not yet demanded, and flinched only when confronted with the smallest detail: his hand. It was not the wound itself, but the way he concealed it that had revealed far more than he intended. She made her way back into the theatre lobby, where Constable Reeves was interviewing members of the troupe who'd trickled in at staggered times for the day's rehearsals, rescheduled and quiet in the shadow of the ongoing investigation. Lavinia joined her, both women taking a discreet seat behind a small potted plant near the corner. Reeves called in Sarah Denning first, the lead actress who had played the vicar's wife. Her voice carried with the kind of theatrical sharpness that seemed to cling even off stage. She sat with legs crossed, eyes scanning the ceiling as though the walls bored her. "I was in the left wing," she said, brushing a speck from her lapel. "Waiting for my final entrance. The curtain dropped, and we all heard the noise. I thought someone had fainted. I didn't know it was Mr. Swan until I saw Alice's face." "You didn't see anyone go backstage before then?" "No." "Why?" "Would I? Everyone was accounted for. We had cues to follow. If someone was backstage, it must have been earlier." "Did Mr. Swan come backstage during rehearsals?" "No," she replied, then added a beat too quickly. "I would have noticed." Miss Marple leaned toward Lavinia. "She didn't say no one, only that he didn't." Reeves nodded, making notes, then called in Clive, the lighting technician. Clive was a broad-shouldered man with a permanent squint from years of stage lights and rigging cables. He sat with a nervous energy that made the stool creak under him. "Any unusual requests during rehearsal week?" Reeves asked. Clive nodded. "Someone borrowed a spanner and one of the old sandbags from upstairs. Said they needed a prop that looked heavy. Didn't think much of it at the time." "Who borrowed them?" He scratched his beard. "Peter, I think. Or maybe one of the newer cast. Tall fellow, dark coat. I assumed he was with the stage crew. Tall fellow? Yeah. Said he was Mr. Swan's nephew. Came by twice that week. Never gave a name. Didn't cause trouble. Miss Marple's interest piqued. Did he speak with anyone else? I saw him chatting with Alice backstage. She seemed to know him. Alice Harmon, the director, was next. She entered with a clipboard clutched tightly against her chest and eyes that darted every few seconds toward the clock on the wall. I've already answered most of this, she began, but her voice wavered slightly as she took a seat. We were in the middle of the act. The curtain falling was a complete shock. Clive mentioned a man visiting you backstage, claimed to be Mr. Swan's nephew. Did you know him? Alice blinked. Nephew? I don't think so. I was introduced to a colleague of Mr. Swan's earlier that week. Said he was researching village theatres for a paper. Could that be who Clive meant? Reeves paused. Do you recall his name? No, sorry. It was quick. He wasn't listed on any guest list. Miss Marple leaned forward, voice light. Strange for a man so curious about theatre not to stay and watch the final performance, isn't it? Alice looked up sharply. I suppose. But I was focused on the show. There was so much going on, I didn't pay close attention to who left or arrived. Miss Marple added gently. Alice stood, her grip tightening on the clipboard. I really must get back to the schedule. We're trying to reschedule for next month. Of course, Miss Marple said. I admire how you keep the show moving forward. After she left, Reeves sighed. Something's off. They're all too ready, like they've had time to rehearse. Miss Marple nodded. A theatre teaches you more than lines. It teaches you control. How to stand, how to breathe, how to make a lie sound like truth. But even the best actors forget one thing. They can't control others' versions of the same lie. They returned to the lobby just as Peter reappeared, clearly summoned for further questioning. He gave a half smile when he saw them, then took a chair across from Reeves. You mentioned a man asking Clive for tools, Reeves began. Clive thinks it might have been you. Peter frowned. I never took anything from Clive. Did you see this tall man in the coat? I might have. I assumed he was local, didn't speak to him. But you said earlier Clive lent someone a spanner. That specific knowledge. I overheard it. Maybe from Clive himself. And your hand? Reeves asked, gesturing to the bandage. Peter hesitated. Caught it backstage on the curtain rig, night after rehearsal. After rehearsal? Not during the performance. I stayed late, he said quickly. Was helping Lavinia tidy up. Miss Marple glanced at Lavinia, who looked puzzled. We finished by 9, she whispered. He wasn't there after me. Peter saw her, expression, and paled. Maybe it was earlier in the week, I'm not sure. Miss Marple let silence stretch. When people feel it, they try to fill it. Peter shifted, cleared his throat. Look, he said finally. I did see Mr. Swan backstage once, not the night he died, before that. He was arguing with someone. Who? Reeves asked. I don't know. I only saw their back. Could have been Alice, or that tall man. But Mr. Swan didn't look. Pleased. Why didn't you mention this earlier? Miss Marple asked. I didn't want to get involved. I thought it had nothing to do with the accident. No, she said. But now it does. Because Peter had just confirmed the one thing no one else dared admit, that Edmund Swan had been backstage before the night of the murder, that someone had lured him there, or threatened him, or met him in secret. And that mask, the rope, the coat, none of them had been random. They were props in someone else's play, a cruel one, carefully staged. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, the picture forming now in shadows and fragments. They were still lying, but not very well, and soon the false scripts would start to crack. Miss Marple walked slowly along the aisle of the empty theatre, the carpeted floor muffling her steps, as her thoughts turned over the puzzle with measured clarity. The deception was layered, not only in the details of the murder, but in the people who surrounded it, each one with something to lose or hide, yet no single story aligning cleanly with the crime. The method was intricate, the setting dramatic, but what eluded her still was the why. There was motive here, many motives in fact, but none yet accounted for the full shape of the murder. She needed to untangle them, not from the crime scene, but from the hearts and histories of those involved. She began with the most obvious. Peter Cresswell. Young, ambitious, and clearly hiding something. His nervous contradiction about the injury, his suspicious knowledge of the spanner, and now the revelation about Mr. Swan arguing with someone backstage, all of it suggested involvement. But involvement was not motive. What reason could a young man barely on the fringe of the production have to kill a man like Edmund Swan? Lavinia, walking beside her, answered that question before Miss Marple could ask it aloud. Peter's father used to work with Edmund years ago in property, I think. Something went badly. There was a legal dispute. His father lost everything and left the village. Peter was raised by his aunt. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. That would explain bitterness. Resentment passed through years like rust on iron, quiet and corrosive. But resentment alone was not enough. Timing, access, and intent still had to align. And then there was Alice Harmon. Miss Marple's mind lingered on the woman's face, tense, evasive, desperate to appear composed. The clipboard had been more than a prop. It had been armor. Alice had known more than she admitted. Her story of meeting a researcher did not match Clive's description of a nephew, nor did she seem surprised that Swan had been backstage. More than that, she had motive that reached beyond personal conflict. Miss Marple recalled something the vicar had mentioned briefly in conversation a day earlier, that the theatre was under financial review, and Mr. Swan, as chairman of the parish, council had threatened to cut its funding. Alice had poured her life into the amateur theatre. She had a stake far deeper than reputation. If funding were pulled, the theatre would be closed, the building sold off, and Alice left without the only position that gave her influence and purpose. She paused by the curtain ropes, eyes drifting upward to the catwalk. The rigging system was simple, reliable, and, most crucially, manual. No complicated automation, just muscle, timing, and gravity. The weapon, likely attached to the curtain drop, would have required someone to prepare it in advance and trigger it from the wings. That meant knowledge of the stage mechanics. Alice, Peter, Clive all knew the system. Sarah Denning likely not Sarah Denning. Sharp-tongued, defensive, too poised for her own good. She claimed to have seen nothing, heard nothing, but her denial was too clean. She'd mentioned Swan had never come backstage, which contradicted Peter's account. Either she was lying, or she'd heard something she didn't want to repeat. Miss Marple remembered her career before moving to Lower Hambledon, modest success in London theatre, followed by sudden withdrawal from acting. Circles, rumours had circulated about an affair with a married director, followed by professional blacklisting. Sarah had come to the village for a fresh start, one she now protected fiercely. And what if Edmund Swan had known something about her past? Had he used that knowledge to influence the funding debate? To threaten her or manipulate someone else? Clive, too, could not be discounted. A man who worked quietly in the rafters, familiar with all backstage systems. He was the only one who claimed to see the mysterious visitor twice. A convenient detail, Miss Marple thought, that offered an unknown scapegoat. If the man in the coat had never existed, then Clive's story became a misdirection. But what would Clive have to gain? The lighting rig had been up for years, untouched. Rumours whispered that repairs were needed and that Clive had filed requests for funds, denied repeatedly by the council. Edmund Swan might have been the one who refused. Him. For Clive, the motive could be professional sabotage, humiliation, frustration. Enough, perhaps, to act. Then there was the mask. Still the most curious piece. If it was part of a travelling troupe long gone, how did it resurface? Miss Marple had asked Lavinia to dig through the theatre's attic records. Earlier that day, Lavinia found a crate, labelled Props, Fairground Night, containing bits of faded bunting, broken juggling pins and 3 masks, 2 blue, 1 red. Only 1 red mask had been found beside Swan's body. The others remained packed. That suggested the killer had gone through old items with intent, not accident. They had chosen that mask, knowing it would evoke anonymity, perhaps even confusion. A prop used as misdirection. And yet, Swan's presence backstage remained the biggest riddle. No one had seen him enter. No cue or reason placed him there naturally. He must have been called or drawn intentionally. Miss Marple began to suspect he had been lured under the pretense of a meeting. Perhaps a private word, perhaps blackmail. And once backstage in position, the mechanism had been triggered. Silent, swift, lethal. But who had enough reason to plan such a scheme? Not just motive, but opportunity. Who had known Swan would be at the theatre that night? Who had access to the curtain ropes? Who had time alone backstage? Alice fit the profile. As director, she had unrestricted access. She also had a strong motive, threatened funding, personal investment, knowledge of stagecraft. But Peter had something Alice didn't: direct, traceable resentment. And Peter had been caught lying. Still, something about Alice's reaction to the unknown man nagged at Miss Marple. Her hesitance, her shifting details. If that man had never existed, why invent him? Unless he had existed, but in a form different from what he claimed. What if this supposed nephew had not been Swan's guest, but his enemy? What if the man who borrowed the spanner, who wandered backstage unseen, was not helping with props, but setting a trap? And what if Alice knew his true identity? Miss Marple considered that carefully. A man who came and went without name or ticket. A man no one could describe beyond tall and wearing a coat. If Peter had seen him, if Clive had helped him unknowingly, and if Alice had protected him, that meant all 3 were involved in a web far more deliberate than she'd first assumed. This was no impulsive crime. It was a collaboration, or perhaps a manipulation of several players. And at the centre was a man who now appeared only in vague recollections and conflicting descriptions. A ghost within the play. Miss Marple turned away from the curtain and stepped toward the back hallway once more. The motive maze was opening now, one thread at a time, not by force, but by listening to what was said, what was unsaid, and what people needed to believe to stay safe. and someone in that theatre had believed their performance would mask the truth. But performances, no matter how polished, always ended the same way, with the final curtain. Constable Reeves returned to the theatre the next morning with a crispness in his step that hadn't been there before. He asked for the green room to be cleared, called in Alice Harmon and Peter Cresswell separately, and then emerged just past 11 with a glint of finality in his eyes. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the lobby, sipped her weak tea and observed him with faint curiosity. Something had changed. Reeves spotted her at once. "Miss Marple," he said with a certain triumph, "I think we've cracked it." "Oh?" she said gently, setting her teacup down. He nodded and gestured toward a plain brown envelope in his hand. "We found the murder weapon, or what we believe to be the weapon. A weighted prop hook, wrapped in red cloth, stained faintly with what appears to be dried blood. It was buried beneath the sandbags backstage, behind the third stack. Clive found it this morning while clearing the area. He said he was following up on something you mentioned." "Yes, I asked about pulley tension," Miss Marple said. "It was curious how silent the curtain fell." "Exactly. And with this object discovered, we've finally got something concrete. Forensics are testing it now. But more than that, we found red fabric at Peter's lodgings. A scarf, matching the embroidery on the missing sash Lavinia described." Miss Marple listened, quiet, expression unreadable. Reeves continued, more confident now. "We also found scratches on the soles of Peter's boots, ones consistent with climbing the old rigging ladder behind the stage wall. He denied it at first, but when pressed, he admitted he'd been up there during rehearsals to watch lighting cues, as he put it. But the story's full of holes. He had motive, family, grievance. He had access, and now we've got physical evidence. Has he confessed?" "Not quite, but he's shaken. I think it's a matter of time. I'm preparing the formal charges." Miss Marple nodded slowly, folding her hands in her lap. "You've done thorough work, Constable. Truly." Reeves tilted his head slightly. "But," she smiled faintly, "but something still doesn't settle. You found the weapon, yes, and it was cleverly hidden. You found fabric that matches what was missing, and you've placed Peter in a compromising location. It all lines up quite neatly. But people don't always act neatly, especially when they're frightened. Tell me, did you notice Peter's reaction this morning when he was brought in again?" He looked cornered, guilty, or terrified. Reeves frowned. "You think he's being framed?" "I think he's involved, certainly. But I think he's playing a part without fully understanding the script. He's hiding something, yes, but not murder. And that distinction matters." She stood, walking slowly toward the theatre's back corridor again, the scent of dust and wood lingering faintly in the air. "This weapon you found, it's important, but its location is too convenient. Buried just deep enough to be missed on the first search, but shallow enough to be found on a second. By Clive, no less." Reeves followed, slower now. "You're suggesting Clive planted it?" "I'm suggesting someone wanted Peter caught, and knew exactly where to plant the right evidence, because they understood how the investigation would progress. But why Peter? Why not Alice or Sarah? Because Peter's young, impulsive, and emotional. He had a public grievance. His father's downfall tied to Swan. That's exactly the kind of motive a clever person would lean into when crafting a misdirection. Frame the one who's most likely to crack under pressure. The one no one would believe if he cried innocence too late. They turned the corner into the green room, now quiet and half-lit by a narrow window. Miss Marple gestured to the rack where the red coat still hung. She reached into the inner pocket once more, drawing out the ticket stub Reeves had catalogued but dismissed. She held it out. Brighton to Lower Hambledon, 2 days before the murder. Seat D4. There were 3 tickets sold under the theatres. Name that evening for guests. 2 used, 1 unclaimed. I checked, Reeves said. No record of who the buyer was. Then I suggest checking who requested the tickets, not who paid, but who asked for them to be held. Reeves looked, confused, then slowly thoughtful. Miss Marple moved to the small chalkboard near the dressing mirrors. Someone had scrawled a week-old rehearsal schedule there, with initials beside the cue times. Actors, she murmured, are very good at remembering blocking, but they're less good at remembering what others were doing off stage. Stepped back, surveying the board. Now look at this. Sarah's cues kept her in the left wing for nearly 10 minutes before the curtain fell. She had no line, no movement. But she was there, waiting. Or so she says. You think she wasn't? I think she was on the catwalk, Miss Marple said calmly, just above the stage, just long enough to set a weighted prop into motion, just long enough to trigger the drop when no one was looking. Reeves exhaled. That's a bold accusation. It's a theory. But the truth always lurks beneath performance. Sarah Denning had more reason than she let on. Her past, whatever she's hiding, was known to Swan. I believe he used it to threaten her, possibly blackmail. And I believe Sarah knew exactly how to kill him without ever being seen. Reeves looked at the coat rack again. But Clive found the weapon, or planted it on her behalf, or at her instruction. He's loyal, perhaps. Even manipulated. She's an actress, Constable, and not an untalented one. At that moment, the theatre door creaked open. Peter stepped in, escorted by another officer. His eyes were red, but not from guilt. Fear had settled into his face in a way Miss Marple recognized from countless young men, boys entangled in things they didn't understand. I didn't kill him, Peter said quietly. I swear it. Miss Marple placed a hand gently on his arm. I know, but you must help us understand who did. And in the silence that followed, Reeves saw the case not as closed, but cracked open again, in a way he hadn't expected. The weapon was real. The motive was real. But the story they had built was only a clever performance. The curtain had fallen too soon on the truth, and somewhere behind the velvet and dust, the true culprit was waiting for their cue. Peter sat on the edge of the green room sofa, hands clasped between his knees, face still drawn and pale. Miss Marple stood across. From him, her tone gentle but firm, her presence steady. Constable Reeves lingered near the doorway, hesitant now, caught between official protocol and the instinct that the woman beside him saw more in silence than any sworn testimony could reveal. Peter, Miss Marple said, you told us you saw Mr. Swan arguing with someone backstage. You claimed you didn't recognize them. But think carefully. Not about what they said, but how they stood, how they moved. Did anything seem familiar? Peter swallowed hard. I've tried. It was dark. Just a shape, really. But the voice. I didn't catch words, not clearly. Just the tone. Clipped. Like someone used to being obeyed. Miss Marple nodded. And did Mr. Swan seem afraid? Not afraid. Angry. Defensive. like he was trying to shut the other person down. "Which tells us something," she said, turning to Reeves. "Whoever confronted him held power, not socially but personally. Enough to provoke, to threaten." Peter shifted. "I think it was a woman." Reeves frowned. "Why didn't you say that before?" "I wasn't sure. I didn't want to make it worse for anyone." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. She thanked Peter softly and walked into the corridor, guiding Reeves with her. When they reached the theatre lobby, she stopped beside the wall of framed photos, decades of productions, grainy images in black and white and faded colour. One photo caught her attention. A much younger Sarah Denning, in costume, standing beside a man in a judge's wig and robes. "Do you recognize him?" she asked. Reeves squinted. "Is that Swan?" "Yes," she said, "years younger before the white hair. Likely in his early days with the parish council. That production was trial by jury, wasn't it?" Reeves checked the date scrawled beneath, 1998, a time when Sarah Denning was still trying to build a career on stage. This wasn't just a hobby for her then, it was her life. And that's not a staged friendship. Look at the way they're standing. Reeves nodded slowly. Comfortable. More than that, confident, as if they had something between them. They moved back through the theatre, Miss Marple requesting the old ledger books stored behind the ticket desk. Lavinia fetched them without question. Inside the records for the 1998 season was a list of contributors, donors and patrons. Edmund Swan's name appeared prominently, one of the largest donors. Beneath it, marked only once, was a second entry under his name, SD, Mentorship. "What's that mean?" Reeves asked. "It means he sponsored her, not just financially but perhaps professionally, introduced her to others, got her roles." Miss Marple turned the page, scanning the months after. An asterisk marked a note beside a committee meeting. Disciplinary hearing, S.D.R.A. incident at regional showcase. No details, just that cryptic remark. "I think Sarah Denning left more than the London theatre behind," Miss Marple said. "She left under a cloud, one that Edmund Swan helped to form." Reeves rubbed his chin. He exposed her? Or withdrew his support, perhaps after a scandal. He was known to be exacting, harsh even. If he turned on her, it could have cost her everything. Reeves was quiet. So she comes to Lower Hambledon years later, reinvents herself, joins the local troupe, and finds him waiting here again, Miss Marple added, older, but no less judgmental, and perhaps, just perhaps, still holding something over her. Reeves looked troubled. But why now? Why kill him now after all this time? "Because some ghosts take years to ripen," she said softly. Maybe he threatened to reveal her past again, or to cut the theatre's funding as retaliation. Maybe he used her history to keep her quiet, to control her. And what about Clive? A loyal man, possibly infatuated, possibly unaware of the full plan. He may have planted the weapon at her request, or under pressure. He doesn't see himself as part of a murder, just as someone doing a favor for someone he admires. Reeves nodded. "It's thin, but it tracks." "It will not remain thin for long," Miss Marple said. "We need to speak to someone who was here back then, who remembers that disciplinary note, perhaps the former vicar, or the council secretary." The trail led them that afternoon to Mrs. Agnes Crowley, once the council's administrative assistant, now long retired and living in a cottage just beyond the post office. Her memory, it turned out, was sharp as ever. "Oh yes," she said when shown the note. "That was a mess. Sarah Denning got caught doctoring a casting list. Replaced a better actress with herself in a showcase. There was a complaint. Came all the way from London. Swan wanted her out completely. Did she fight it? She did. Cried, begged. Claimed he led her on. Then turned cold. I don't know if it was true, but she was removed quietly. No press, no scandal, just gone. Next we heard, she'd vanished from the circuit." Reeves and Miss Marple returned to the theatre in silence. It was no longer speculation, it was history, resurfacing. Sarah had motive rooted not in recent disputes, but in buried humiliation. And now, as everything closed in, the question was not just what she'd done, but what she might do next. Inside the green room, Sarah sat by the mirror, applying makeup as if preparing for a performance that no longer existed. She caught Miss Marple's reflection behind her and smiled faintly. "Come to accuse me again?" she asked. "No," Miss Marple said. "Not yet." Sarah turned slowly, meeting her eyes. "Then what?" "To ask one last question. When you told us Mr. Swan never came backstage, was that to protect him or yourself?" Sarah's smile didn't falter, but her eyes turned brittle. "It's always the same with people like you. You think we're all playing parts." "No," Miss Marple said. "Only some of us know the script better than others." Outside, Reeves waited with the theatre's keys in his hand. Shadows lengthened across the street as evening fell. And somewhere inside that aging playhouse, amid dust and memory, the truth prepared for its final entrance. Miss Marple returned to the theatre early the next morning, long before the constable or the cast arrived. The corridors were silent now, the air heavier than before, as though the building itself had absorbed the tension of the past days. She moved slowly along the edge of the stage, fingertips brushing the velvet curtain, pausing beneath the catwalk where the curtain mechanism had been tampered with. The performance was over, but the final act had not yet been played. She knew Sarah Denning had something to hide. Too much precision in her evasions, too much calm in the face of suspicion. But still, there was no confession, no mistake. Only controlled silence, and so Miss Marple decided to provoke what silence could not contain. Not by confrontation, not with accusation, but with something far more unsettling. Theatre. By mid-afternoon, she'd asked Lavinia to call everyone involved back to the theatre for a restaging exercise, something Miss Marple claimed was meant to clarify timeline inconsistencies for the inquest. Lavinia, though puzzled, obeyed, and by 4 o'clock, the actors, crew and staff were gathered on stage, each wearing the same expressions they had the day after the curtain fell. Uneasy, guarded, tired of suspicion. Constable Reeves stood by, skeptical but curious. Miss Marple took centre stage with a folded paper in her hand, which she opened like a director preparing a scene. She looked around the semicircle of faces, Alice, Peter, Clive, Sarah, and a few lesser cast members, and smiled warmly. "I appreciate your cooperation," she said. "Today I simply want us to recreate the blocking for the final 10 minutes before the incident. Nothing dramatic, just simple positions. Alice, if you could place everyone where they were just before the curtain fell." Alice hesitated, then began directing people with stiff motions, guiding Sarah to the left wing, Peter to the opposite side, and Clive toward the lighting booth. Miss Marple watched every movement, Not where they stood, but how they stood. Who shifted their weight, who avoided eye contact. Then she handed each of them a prop. A simple item, something from the set. A candlestick, a cushion, a folded playbill. And finally to Sarah she handed a long red sash. Not the original, but one remarkably similar. Lavinia had found it earlier in the attic props bin. Sarah took it without comment, holding it like a piece of scenery she had no reason to fear. Miss Marple turned toward the stage crew. Can we dim the house lights for a moment, just as they were on the night in question? The lights dropped, shadows fell, and Miss Marple's voice, quiet but clear, rose again. Now imagine, if you will, that the audience is out there. Imagine the final cue line has been spoken. You're preparing for your entrance, or your last exit. And just above your head, something is waiting to fall. Everyone stood still. No one moved. Miss Marple let the silence stretch. Then she looked at Sarah directly. Now, she said gently, tie the sash to that rigging hook behind you. Sarah blinked. Why? Just for the scene. For memory's sake. But Sarah didn't move. Miss Marple stepped forward, her tone casual. Surely you remember how it was done. You've always had excellent spatial awareness. And this sash, so like the one that went missing, would have made a perfect tether, wouldn't it? Still no response. Peter looked around, confused. Clive rubbed his jaw, uncertain. Miss Marple moved closer to Sarah. You see, the brilliance of theatre is not that it hides things, but that it shows us who we are, especially when we believe we're still acting. Sarah dropped the sash, not threw it, not tossed it, dropped it, deliberate, slow, like it had grown hot in her hands. Miss Marple kept her voice soft. You didn't mean for the weight to kill him, did you? Only to frighten him, to send a message, but something went wrong, the timing, or the swing. Sarah looked down. You're mistaken. No, Miss Marple said. You're just too proud to admit a miscalculation. Reeves stepped forward, but Miss Marple held up a hand. I used this test for one reason only, because a person with nothing to hide would have tied the sash, even just to prove me wrong. But you didn't, because the act is still too close to you, because the muscle remembers even when the mind pretends to forget. Sarah's voice cracked. I never meant for it to happen that way. The room stilled. Peter stepped back, stunned. Clive stared at the floor. Sarah raised her head slowly. He ruined my life. You don't know what it's like to watch your entire career dissolve because of one man's judgment. He told me he'd bury the theatre if I didn't resign from the next production, that he'd make it look professional, like before. But it was punishment. Again. You brought him backstage, Miss Marple said. He followed you, perhaps out of curiosity or out of arrogance. He laughed when I threatened to scare him, said I'd never follow through, said no one would believe I had the courage. And when the weight fell, Miss Marple asked. I didn't pull the curtain, Sarah whispered. I only tied the hook. Someone else pulled it early, I swear it. Reeves moved beside her. Who? Sarah turned to look at the others, eyes drifting over Peter, over Alice, then landing on Clive. Clive didn't deny it. I thought it was the cue, he said. She told me to pull when she gave the nod. I saw her raise her hand. I thought... She was just brushing her hair, Miss Marple said. Not signalling. Clive sat heavily on a nearby crate. I didn't know. God help me, I didn't know. Sarah looked at him, a bitter twist in her mouth. You always wanted to help me. You helped too well. Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. Then she walked forward, gathering the sash from the floor and folding it neatly. It's a strange thing, she said finally. How violence creeps in through intentions. No one planned to kill, but someone still died. Reeves took Sarah gently by the arm. No need for force. Her shoulders had already dropped, the fight long gone. Clive followed silently, not cuffed, but equally ruined. Miss Marple remained behind as the stage cleared. The curtain, still patched from the night it had fallen, swayed lightly in the draught. She stepped to the front of the stage and looked out into the empty house. Actors always said the hardest moment wasn't the line or the spotlight, but the pause after the performance, when the silence comes and the truth has no place to hide. The theatre stood in silence once more, emptied of its false confessions and trembling performances. Sarah Denning had broken, not shattered, but fractured enough to expose her guilt in part, her fury in full. Clive, stunned and solemn, had been taken for questioning, his role likely to be measured in degrees of complicity rather than premeditation. It should have marked the beginning of the end, the turning point. But Miss Marple, standing alone by the stage's edge as dusk sank into the village outside, felt no satisfaction, only unease. That night, Constable Reeves personally escorted the sash and the red-stained hook to the station, logging them in under lock and key. Sarah remained in custody, no formal charge yet placed, but the weight of truth pressing in. Clive was released under watch, his statement matching much of what Miss Marple had suspected. Yet something still hovered at the edge of it all, unseen, but certain. The next morning, Miss Marple arrived at the station with a list of requests. She wanted access to the evidence logs to verify item entries, and she asked that the theatre be placed under temporary seal to ensure no further tampering. Reeves, though weary, complied. He too had begun to feel the case shifting, like a play that promised a final scene, then kept going. But by midday, something unexpected occurred. The evidence locker was empty, the red sash, the bronze hook, even the theatre records Lavinia had provided for context, all gone. The lock had not been broken, the chain of custody had not been breached. The items had simply vanished. Reeves stood frozen in front of the open locker, his jaw tight. There were only 3 people with key access, he said. Myself, Sergeant Wren, and Jenkins on night duty. And Jenkins? Miss Marple asked, calmly. Home ill, didn't even clock in last night. Then Wren? I've already sent for him. Miss Marple looked at the emptied shelf, where the objects that had anchored truth were now just absences. The hook and the sash had meant more than physical proof. They had connected motive to method, past to present. Without them, Sarah's confession, already strained, would falter under legal scrutiny. Clive's cooperation might be dismissed as hearsay. The case, so close to resolution, would dissolve like mist. Reeves paced. I'll issue a formal alert. We'll search both their homes, review every camera from last night to this morning. No, Miss Marple said softly. Do something else. He paused. What? Call everyone back to the theatre. Reeves stared. Why? We don't have any. Because the thief will be there. He frowned. You think whoever stole the evidence will walk into a room with us? I think they never left the stage at all. By late afternoon, the cast and crew gathered again. No rehearsal was scheduled, no statement given. just Reeves standing quietly in the wings, and Miss Marple at the edge of the seating area, her gaze scanning each face. Sarah was absent, still under supervision. Clive, drawn and quiet, sat near the exit. Alice Harmon, pale and composed, arrived, late, and took her seat without speaking. Peter stood by the far wall, arms crossed. Lavinia lingered beside the ticket booth. Miss Marple waited until the room settled into its natural discomfort. Then she stepped forward. "There has been a theft," she said calmly. "Crucial evidence in the case has gone missing, stolen from the station sometime in the last 24 hours. The reaction was immediate. Murmurs, glances, tension cutting across the rows. Clive looked stunned. Alice shifted in her seat. Peter's brows pinched. "Let me be clear," Miss Marple continued. "This is no longer about an accident, nor is it solely about murder. This is about the truth being buried, again. And someone in this room is helping do the burying." Alice stood. "That's a serious accusation." "No," Miss Marple replied. "What's serious is the pattern. First a murder disguised as an accident, then evidence planted to implicate a boy, then a confession, partial, strained, and now the erasure of physical proof. That is not the work of chaos. That is design." Clive stood suddenly, his voice cracking. "You think I took it?" "No," she said. "I think you're done helping people lie." He sank back down. Miss Marple turned to Alice. "You fought for this theatre, poured yourself into it. But you've always stayed just behind the curtain, never quite the villain, never quite the victim. And you told me something on the first day I didn't forget. You said Mr. Swan threatened to pull funding, that he'd destroy the theatre." Alice's jaw tightened. "He did. Because of Sarah. Because of all of us. He hated what this place had become. Said it was amateurish, a waste of the council's resources." Miss Marple took a step closer. "He threatened your legacy. And Sarah, volatile, broken, she was the perfect weapon. But the plan went wrong, didn't it?" Alice said nothing. "You didn't plan to kill him. But once he died, once Sarah confessed, you saw a chance to preserve something bigger than yourself." Still silence. "So you went to the station, or had someone go. You removed the evidence, because without it, there is no case. Sarah's story becomes another tragedy, and the theatre survives." "I didn't," Alice began, but her voice broke. Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. "You didn't kill Edmund Swan, but you're still complicit, because preservation at the cost of truth is still betrayal." Alice lowered her head. Reeves moved forward, gently but firmly. "We'll need to search your home, Miss Harmon." She didn't argue. She simply rose and walked with him. The theatre emptied again. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops of Lower Hambledon, Miss Marple sat alone in the front row. The stage before her held only dust and silence. The evidence was gone, but the deception it symbolized had not vanished. It had merely changed shape. And the truth, however fragile, still held enough weight to be seen. Because in the theatre, as in life, some props are only illusions. But some, like motive, guilt and conscience, never quite disappear. The village awoke to rain the next. Morning, steady, cold and grey as stone. It glazed the cobbled streets and slicked the roofs of Lower Hambledon, pooling in the dips of the theatre's awning and dripping steadily over its old wooden sign. Inside, the building remained quiet, sealed off since the disappearance of the evidence. Miss Marple stood beneath the gallery archway, watching the shadows stir against the windows across the square. Constable Reeves had searched Alice Harmon's home. He'd found fragments of cloth in her fireplace, barely distinguishable from the ash, but no sign of the sash or the hook. She denied everything, taking the evidence, destroying it, helping Sarah. But her silence now held a bitter resignation. She had not confessed, but she had stopped resisting. The case, it seemed, was settling into its final shape. But then the telephone rang at the station just after 10 o'clock, and everything changed. Peter Cresswell was missing. Reeves arrived at his lodgings to find the door open, the bedding untouched, and his personal belongings left behind except for his coat. His landlady hadn't seen him since the previous evening. He'd returned late, alone, and appeared rattled. Not angry, not afraid, just unsure. Miss Marple stood in the boy's room beside Reeves, her gaze moving over the little details others would miss. The shoes tucked neatly near the wardrobe. The book left open on the desk, spine upward. The crumpled note in the waste bin, scrawled and then torn in half. She knelt, carefully flattening the paper. It read only a few words. "You said you'd protect me," Reeves muttered. No sign of struggle. Nothing taken. "It wasn't a break-in," Miss Marple said quietly. "He left willingly, but not confidently." "You think someone lured him?" "Not lured. Summoned." Reeves looked at her. "Alice? She's under watch. Sarah? She's behind bars and frightened." Reeves sighed. "Then who?" Miss Marple stood slowly, eyes still distant. "Someone Peter trusted, or someone who knew how to sound like someone he trusted." The rain kept falling. By afternoon, a search party was formed. Villagers combed the woodland paths and the riverbank behind the church. The station coordinated checkpoints. But it wasn't until late that evening, after the rain had thinned to a mist, that someone found the trail. It was Clive. He'd returned to the theatre alone, claiming he needed to retrieve tools. But Reeves, suspicious of his movements, followed him from a distance and found him not at the stage but in the cellar. And there, in the far corner behind stacked crates and discarded props, they found the coat Peter had been wearing, folded neatly, dry, too dry, as though it hadn't seen the rain at all. Reeves turned to Clive, his voice sharp.
"Where is he?" Clive stammered. I don't know, I swear. I just saw the coat, I didn't touch anything." Miss Marple arrived minutes later, her steps deliberate. She looked at the coat, then at Clive, then past them both, into the
deep dark beneath the theatre, where history and guilt seemed to breathe together. "Someone wanted Peter gone," she said. "Not to hurt him, perhaps, but to silence him, or use him. He knew something, or suspected something." Reeves frowned. But what could he possibly have that others didn't? Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Then she walked to the edge of the room and opened an old drawer in the prop cabinet. She pulled out a crumpled program from the most recent play, The Vicar's Mistake. She flipped to the cast list. "Look here," she said. "The stage hands roll, a background part, no lines, no stage direction." Reeves leaned over. "Played by Matthew Goran?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Matthew Goran hasn't lived in this village in 2 years. He moved to Shropshire, and yet his name was printed." So someone performed that role in his place, but no one ever asked who. Clive swallowed hard. I don't remember. I thought it was just a new volunteer. Uncredited, Miss Marple said. Unseen, always in shadow. A perfect way to move backstage. To watch, to manipulate cues, even to handle props. Reeves stared. You think someone used the show to insert themselves into the theatre unnoticed? I do, she said, and I think Peter figured it out, perhaps only yesterday, and now he's gone. Clive backed away slightly. No one strange. Ever came near the curtain, I'd have seen them. Would you? Miss Marple asked, turning to him. Would you have seen them if they knew exactly when to come and go? If they'd worn the mask during rehearsal? Used your loyalty as their cover? Clive's face twitched. You said I didn't do it. I said you didn't kill Swan, Miss Marple replied. But you opened doors. You followed instructions. You let someone else inside. Reeves stepped forward. And now we need to find out who that someone is before Peter's just another name on the program. But there was no time for arrests. No time for interviews. Because 2 hours later, a scream rang out through Lower Hambledon. It came from the church hall, where Lavinia had been preparing props for the next village fete. She'd stumbled into the side room and found Peter, not dead, but tied to a chair, gagged and shivering. He'd been drugged. Shallow scratches on his wrists, a bruise on the side of his head, but alive. Reeves and Miss Marple arrived within minutes. Peter, groggy and frightened, clung to Lavinia's arm. I didn't see who it was. They wore gloves, a voice, faint like whispering through cloth. They said I'd ruined everything. Everything? Miss Marple asked gently. Did they say what they meant? Peter shook his head. Just that the curtain wasn't supposed to fall. Not like that. They blamed me for something. They said I'd noticed too much. Reeves leaned in. Why? The church. Peter blinked. They said it was fitting. Said the final confession belonged in a place like this. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. That's not anger. That's performance. This is someone who sees the world in scenes. She turned to Reeves. We haven't caught the true villain. They're still here, still watching, still waiting to finish the act. And for the first time in days, Reeves didn't try to argue, because the curtain had not fallen yet. It had only been drawn. The next morning brought no answers, only wind. The sky remained overcast, the clouds low and heavy, pressing down on the village with a brooding hush. Miss Marple sat at the corner table of the tea shop opposite the theatre, hands wrapped around a cup gone tepid, her mind looping over the last 24 hours. Peter was safe, but shaken beyond words. The boy had been targeted, not for what he had done, but for what he had almost realized. And whoever had taken him had done so not in panic, but with precision. Across the square, Constable Reeves emerged from the station, his coat whipping behind him in the breeze. He joined her at the table without waiting to be invited, rubbing his hands together and shaking his head. No fingerprints, no witnesses. No one saw who took Peter or brought him to the church. And Peter, well, he's trying, but it's all flashes and shadows. Miss Marple nodded quietly. The mask, the whisper, the language. You ruined everything, Reeves muttered. That doesn't sound like someone trying to hide. That sounds like someone trying to finish a script. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Yes, and not a new script either. Reeves raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? She looked past him, toward the old theatre building, toward its flaking trim and rain-stained windows. Something's been bothering me since the beginning. Something small. During the first rehearsal, I observed someone mentioned an old carnival troupe. Lavinia remembered them. A few masks, a travelling show years ago. And then there was that crate in the attic. Props from a one-night performance left to gather dust. Reeves blinked. The one with the red mask. The same, she said. And one thing stood out. Why was the red mask chosen? Of all the old pieces to use in a murder, why something so theatrical, so obvious? To create confusion? To create familiarity? Reeves sat back. You're saying the killer wasn't just choosing at random? They were recreating something? Miss Marple nodded slowly. A performance, a moment, perhaps even an unresolved scene from long ago. Reeves rubbed his chin. We've looked through the programs. The troupe only performed one show, Carnival of Shadows, back in '03. No names we recognized, apart from a young Alice Harmon listed as a stage assistant. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. There, that's it. What is? Not who was listed. Who wasn't? She pulled a small notebook from her handbag, worn at the edges. She flipped through until she reached a page where she had copied details from the attic crate. 3 masks, she murmured. 2 blue, 1 red. But Lavinia said she remembered 4 performers. The acrobat, the musician, the ringmaster, and the masked mime. No lines, just movements. Reeves frowned. The mime. He wore the red mask, she said. He never spoke. He only mimicked others, reflected their gestures back at them. They said it was haunting, unsettling, that no one ever saw his face. Reeves exhaled. And now someone's taken that mask, returned to the theatre, and started playing that same role, silently, invisibly, behind everyone. Yes, she said, because this isn't about murder alone. It's about restaging, reliving. Someone is rebuilding that show. Reeves stood quickly. The archive. If there's a list of names, maybe we can match it. Miss Marple stood too, more slowly. Don't look for names. Look for patterns. They returned to the theatre, now locked again under police watch. Inside the archive office, Miss Marple moved methodically, pulling out the box from the 2003 performance. Programs, costume notes, set sketches, all curled at the edges, all soaked faintly with dust. She flipped through until she found a set of lighting cues scrawled in a different hand, small, precise, with obsessive annotation, Clive's handwriting. Reeves blinked. He worked the lights back then, apparently, and not just the lights. These margin notes, see here, cue delay on mime's entrance, spotlight shift for mirror scene, silhouette emphasis, backstage shadow only. She looked up. Someone planned every move of the mime to create unease. They built the performance around silence. Reeves opened another folder and froze. Jane. She crossed to him. He held up a photo. 4 figures in costume. The blue masks. The acrobat. The musician. The ringmaster. And the red-masked mime, crouched in the background. There was no name beneath the mime, but there was a handwritten note scribbled across the bottom corner. Only Peter matched the movement. Cast change mid-rehearsal. Goran out. Miss Marple whispered. Peter played the mime. Reeves looked stunned. That doesn't make sense. He would have been, what, 16? 16. Quiet, observant. Recruited late when the other boy dropped out. Reeves turned the photo over. But why doesn't Peter remember it? because he wasn't meant to. They erased him from the records, kept the costume, kept the movement, but left him out of the final program. Reeves's brow furrowed. And now he's been targeted again. Miss Marple looked back at the masks. He doesn't remember playing the mime. But someone does. Someone who hated that he was better, that he took their part. Someone who waited all these years to rebuild the story the way they wanted it told. Reeves shook his head slowly. You think we've been chasing a motive built on professional jealousy? I think we've been chasing a ghost, she said. A ghost who's alive. Who hid not in shadows, but in tradition. In the theatre. In the names we never questioned. She pointed to the crate again. Inside, beneath the fabric lining, lay a script, annotated, rewritten. The final page was newly inserted, not yellowed with age, typed. One line underlined. When the curtain falls, the mime takes his bow. Miss Marple whispered. They're not finished. And for the first time, Reeves didn't speak. Because the pattern had revealed itself at last, and the next act was already in motion. Reeves sat motionless, the script resting in his hands, as though it might burn through the paper. The line stared back at them. When the curtain falls, the mime takes his bow. A phrase theatrical in tone but chilling in intent, not a metaphor, a declaration. Miss Marple stood beside him, her gaze drifting not to the script, but to the name that wasn't in it. Peter, erased from memory, from credit from history. And yet he had been there, crouched behind the mask, mimicking movements, absorbing the rhythm of others while remaining silent. The perfect shadow. Forgotten by everyone, except one. She turned slowly. Reeves, we've spent so long trying to determine who committed the murder that we never stopped to ask why it was committed the way it was. The mask, the curtain, the stage. It wasn't just theatre as setting, it was theatre as language. Reeves exhaled, and the killer was speaking in it. Yes, she said softly, not to confuse us, but to be understood. They returned. To the theatre, not because there was anything new to find, but because it was the only place that still held the killer's shape. The space hummed with past movement, stage dust, and voices long since gone. They walked the wings in silence until Miss Marple paused beneath the catwalk, just beside the pulley rope that had once ended Edmund Swan's life. Swan was not random, she said. Nor was Sarah. They were supporting roles in someone else's production. This has never been about vengeance alone. It was about authorship. Reeves leaned against the wall, arms folded. You think someone wanted to rewrite the past? To correct it, she said. To fix it. The original performance was disrupted. Peter replaced someone in the mime's role. He was better. And someone, likely someone older, more experienced, more ambitious, was cast aside, quietly forgotten, but they didn't forget. Reeves's brow furrowed. And they came back to replay the entire show, with themselves in control. Miss Marple turned, her expression grim. Reeves, how many of the original cast from that 2003 show are still in the village? He thought. Alice, Clive, Lavinia. Sarah was involved, but peripherally. She nodded. Now think again. Who wasn't in the program, but was always present? Who lingered backstage? Who controlled cues? Who moved props without ever taking credit for a single performance? Reeves blinked. Not Clive, he was young, and Lavinia wasn't even listed as stage crew yet, just costume assistant. But someone had access to the stage, the rigging, The prop notes. His voice trailed off. Reeves, Miss Marple said gently. Where is the current theatre caretaker? He froze. Godfrey Pelham. Yes, she said. Quiet, unassuming, always around, always with keys. Maintains the lights, the ropes, the cellar, knows the layout better than anyone, but never part of the performance. Reeves stared. He took over as caretaker after the 2003 production, after the old technician left. And before that? Reeves shook his head. I don't know. No one's ever asked. They went together to the caretaker's cottage, tucked behind the theatre's side lot. The building looked as ordinary as ever. Paint peeling, gutters loose, windows smudged. Reeves knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still silence. Then Miss Marple turned the handle. Unlocked. The smell inside was faintly metallic. Old tools, damp cloth and ink. The main room was cluttered with rolled backdrops, spools of theatre wire, and a narrow table covered in journals. Dozens of them. Miss Marple picked one up and opened it to a page near the middle. Scene 3, final cue must be mine. Mirror replaced. Reflection returned. Reeves opened another. He took my part. I watched from the dark. I learned the rhythm. I waited. He turned a few more pages. One was marked entirely in red ink. I wear the mask again. This time they will see me. Miss Marple looked slowly around the room. He was the original mime. Reeves whispered, and Peter replaced him. Godfrey must have been in his 20s back then. Perhaps unreliable, or just too abstract for the director's liking. They gave his part to Peter, who was younger, more disciplined, and they erased Godfrey's name to avoid embarrassment. Reeves muttered, and he spent the next 20 years watching them build their little theatre around his humiliation. No, Miss Marple said, he wasn't humiliated. He was excluded. And worse, he was silent. The role they stripped from him was one that never spoke to begin with. He couldn't even protest in the metaphor he'd come to identify with. They found the red mask on a mannequin in the far corner, carefully preserved, polished, reverent. Reeves pulled out his radio. We need units at the theatre, now. But even as he said it, Miss Marple's gaze moved to the wall behind the mannequin. A single page, pinned to a corkboard. A fresh note. Opening night was never finished. Curtain rises again. Tonight. Reeves looked at her. He's going. Back. She turned at once. He wants his moment. Not as killer, but as performer. Reeves ran. By the time they reached the theatre, the lights were already on. Not just the work lights. Stage lights. Bright, focused, waiting. The front doors were open. Inside, the stage was set for Carnival of Shadows. The same backdrop from 2003, unrolled, faded but intact. Props arranged precisely. 3 mannequins stood in costume. The acrobat, the musician, the ringmaster. And then a figure stepped forward from the darkness behind the curtain, wearing the red mask. Godfrey. He moved silently, his gestures fluid, deliberate, mimicking applause, then bowing low, then placing a hand to his chest in mock sorrow. His eyes shone through the mask, fevered and gleaming. He was not hiding anymore. Reeves raised his voice. Godfrey, this is over. But Godfrey did not stop. He stepped to center stage and raised a gloved hand, repeating the final motion from the original mime act. A sweeping circle, then a pause, as if listening for a cue only he could hear. Miss Marple stepped forward slowly. You waited all these years to be seen. And now you are. Godfrey turned toward her. She spoke gently. But the tragedy is that they were never your audience. You built a stage for ghosts. He stood still. The silence pressed in. Then, with careful grace, he removed the red mask and smiled. Not with malice, but with peace, because in his mind the performance was complete, and at last he had taken his. Bow. The air inside the theatre turned still, the way it does just before a performance begins. But there was no audience now. Only Constable Reeves standing tense at the foot of the stage, and Miss Marple in the aisle, unmoving as Godfrey Pelham stood in the spotlight, mask lowered, his face bare, breathing slowly as though relishing the last lines of a forgotten soliloquy. His expression was not wild or broken. It was calm, too calm. He looked down at them and spoke, not with menace, but with the cadence of someone performing a role for the last time. You came, he said, voice hoarse but steady. I wondered if you would. Miss Marple took a slow step forward. You left an invitation. Godfrey's head tilted slightly, almost amused. They never came. The others, Sarah, Alice, even Clive. They were part of it, but none of them saw. Not then. Not now. Reeves kept his hand near his holster but didn't move. It's over, Mr. Pelham. Godfrey's gaze shifted toward him, unbothered. I haven't hurt anyone since Peter. He's safe. I knew he would be. That's why I left him in the church, so you'd find him. Miss Marple's voice was steady. You didn't want to disappear. You wanted to be seen. He nodded slowly. You understand. Finally, someone does. You could have spoken years ago, Reeves said, eyes fixed on the man. You could have asked for recognition, an apology. Instead, you killed Swan. Godfrey's eyes flashed, not rage, but something deeper. Swan never apologized for anything. He didn't forget me. He dismissed me. He told them I wasn't right for the part. He made me invisible. You weren't invisible, Miss Marple said softly. You were erased. And you lived with that silence until it grew into something else. Godfrey's hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with restraint. You think this was about revenge, he said. You think I did all of this for vengeance. But I didn't kill Swan because he ruined me. I killed him because he tried to ruin Peter too. Reeves tensed. What do you mean? Godfrey stepped closer to the edge of the stage. He remembered. Swan remembered what happened back then. He remembered taking my name off the program and giving my part to a boy. And when Peter came back to the theatre years later, started volunteering, started moving well, Swan saw it again. The same natural rhythm, and he hated it. Miss Marple's breath caught. He tried to push Peter out. Godfrey nodded, quietly, through Alice, through changes in casting, through private conversations, said Peter was too withdrawn. Not fit for performance, but I saw it. I saw what I'd seen 20 years ago. I wasn't going to let him do it again. So you planned the accident, Reeves said. The curtain, the weighted hook. Godfrey gave a faint smile. I didn't mean to kill him, truly. I only meant to scare him. A symbol, the mask, the drop, just enough to remind him. But Sarah pulled the curtain early. I never told her to. She mistook a gesture. She thought it was time. Miss Marple's voice was nearly a whisper. She believed she was helping. I didn't want her to confess, Godfrey said. But Once she did, it was too late to unwind it. And when Peter started asking questions, when I realized he was remembering more than he knew, I had to stop him too. Reeves took a step forward. "So you abducted him?" "I protected him," Godfrey said, almost pleading now. He would have kept digging, would have blamed Sarah, would have destroyed himself. But it wasn't his fault. It was never his fault. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but unrelenting. "And what was tonight, Godfrey? Another performance, or a final act?" He didn't answer at first. Then he slowly turned and gestured toward the mannequins in costume behind him. The blue-masked players, the old backdrop, the notes pinned along the stage wall. "I built it again," he said. "Exactly as it was. Exactly as it should have been. I thought, maybe if they saw it now they'd understand what they missed, what they discarded." Reeves shook his head slowly. "No one discarded you, Godfrey. They overlooked you, and you let that oversight become your identity." Godfrey stared at him, jaw clenched, but no rebuttal came. Miss Marple stepped forward again, closer now, voice still soft but edged with steel. "This isn't theatre anymore. This is real. The story doesn't end with the bow. There are consequences, and the longer you stay on this stage, the more you risk turning tragedy into farce." Godfrey looked at her, something flickering in his eyes, pain, relief, exhaustion. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped. Reeves moved swiftly, climbing onto the stage in a single stride. Godfrey didn't resist. He lowered his head and placed the mask back onto the table beside him, like a relic returned to its altar. They led him off stage in silence. Miss Marple remained behind for a long moment. She stepped up to the empty centre and looked out into the house, rows of vacant seats, the faint creak of the rafters above. The stage no longer pulsed with danger. It was quiet, hollow. Later, she sat beside Peter in the lobby. He was pale, still shaken, but more present than he had been since his release. "I remembered," he said finally. "Not everything, just the feeling, the weight of the mask, the way it muffled the world." Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes memory isn't a picture, it's an echo." Peter looked at her. Why did he do all this? She met his eyes, kind but unsparing. Because he was written out of his own story, and he didn't know how to stop performing, even when no one was watching. Peter said nothing, but he understood. Outside, the theatre's lights flickered off one by one, and at last the curtain fell. For good. The calm that settled over Lower Hambledon in the days after Godfrey's arrest was the kind that felt more like an exhale than a resolution. The villagers returned to their routines with quiet murmurs about theatre ghosts and curtain deaths, but no one truly spoke of what had happened. The theatre remained closed, the performances suspended indefinitely, and Godfrey Pelham waited quietly in custody, unresisting, even oddly at peace. For Constable Reeves, it was a rare kind of closure. For Peter, a release from fear. And for Miss Marple, it should have been the end. But something still itched in the back of her mind. She returned to the theatre one final time, alone. The space was cold and silent, the stage stripped of its final production. Only the bare wood remained now, the echoes of Godfrey's final confession still caught in its boards. She stood at the edge of the catwalk, glancing toward the pulley, system once used as a weapon, and let her thoughts spiral not backward, but outward. The performance Godfrey staged had been obsessive in its detail, but not spontaneous. The backdrop, the mannequins, the script, the timing, it was planned with the mind of someone who had prepared for years. Yet even in all his confessions, Godfrey never once mentioned how he had retrieved the original props, restored the script, or known exactly where Peter had been in the records. That had always nagged at her. He had been the architect, but someone else had been his archivist. She descended the narrow staircase backstage and stepped into the theatre's dusty records room. The same space where she had once found the old playbills and the handwritten lighting notes. She moved to the cabinet where Lavinia had first pulled out the 2003 files. A habit, more than anything. A final glance. She opened the drawer and paused. The 2003 program folder was missing. All others were in place. 1997, 1998, 2002, 2004, 2005. But the folder that had triggered this entire spiral was gone. Not misplaced. Removed. She stepped back into the light and walked briskly to the costume room, where Lavinia still worked now and again, trying to help the council decide whether to reopen the theatre or sell it. Lavinia looked up as she entered. "Oh, Jane, I didn't expect you again. I only need a moment." Miss Marple didn't sit. "The 2003 programme is missing." Lavinia blinked. "What do you mean?" "From the records room. It was there. Last week." "Are you sure?" "I am." Lavinia shifted slightly. "Perhaps the constables took it." Miss Marple studied her. "No. I asked Reeves before I came. He said they'd already scanned and returned all records. That one was marked in the return list." Lavinia's smile faltered. "You were the first to mention the carnival masks," Miss Marple said softly. "You remembered them vividly. Their colour, their shape. You said they were never used again, but you knew exactly where to find the crate." "I was just helping," Lavinia said quickly. "I've been working with the theatre since 2004, Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Not 2003. That was your first year in costume. You weren't officially on staff the year of Carnival of Shadows." Lavinia's face tightened. "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "you remembered everything, down to the missing red sash, down to who used what prop. You even said Peter's father had a feud with Swan, but that was never public. I checked. That information was only mentioned in an old grant rejection letter stored in the council's archives." Lavinia said, "Nothing." "Godfrey was obsessed, yes," Miss Marple said, "but he was clumsy. He never read the old minutes or the grant denials. He never accessed those restricted files. He wasn't looking for records, only memory." Lavinia's voice was flat. "And you think I fed him?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "you wrote the final script." The room went very still. Lavinia turned slowly to the mirror by the costume rack. She adjusted a collar on one of the mannequins. "The gesture too casual, too rehearsed. He deserved it," she said after a moment. "Swan, he ruined everything, for so many of us." "You were cast in the original play," Miss Marple said, "but dropped after 2 rehearsals." Lavinia gave a small smile. "He said I was too wooden, too cold." "He said that about many," Miss Marple replied, "but most let it pass." "I couldn't." Lavinia's voice broke just slightly. "I loved this theatre. I gave it everything. And then he decided I wasn't worth the role, so he erased me, like he erased Godfrey, like he tried to erase Peter." "So you restored the performance," Miss Marple said. "Found someone willing to wear the mask, fed his bitterness until it mirrored your own." Lavinia nodded slowly. "He thought it was his idea, but it wasn't." Miss Marple stepped closer. "Why Peter?" because he was a loose thread. He was going to ruin the symmetry. Godfrey started to hesitate. The guilt got to him. Peter made him see the boy he used to be. I couldn't let it fall apart. Miss Marple's voice was sharp now. So you took the evidence? I burned it, Lavinia said. I had to. Godfrey was crumbling. He would have turned himself in weeks ago if I hadn't kept pushing. You made him believe it was a performance, Miss Marple said. But it was your story. Lavinia turned back toward her. Every theatre needs a director. Miss Marple held her gaze, and every tragedy ends with an unmasking. Outside, footsteps approached, Reeves arriving at her request. He entered quietly, saw Lavinia, saw Miss Marple's nod, and said nothing. Lavinia didn't resist. She only reached behind her, took one final look at the crimson sash pinned to the wall and whispered he was never meant to die, he was only meant to watch. Then she was gone, escorted out, coat buttoned, steps measured, like someone leaving a final curtain call. And at last, the theatre was empty, of players, of scripts, of ghosts, but not of memory. That would linger, always, the quiet after Lavinia's. Her rest was not the clean, satisfying silence of a curtain's final drop. It was something denser, lingering, unfinished. Reeves completed the formal statement himself that evening, though his pen slowed several times as he reached the section on motive. There was no simple word for it, no line on a report form that could summarize the slow erosion of resentment, the hollowed-out ambition, or the performance built not for applause, but retribution. Lavinia Cooper, former costume hand and lifelong theatre loyalist, had orchestrated the entire thing. Godfrey was only ever the mask, literal and figurative. She had fed him memories, bent his loneliness into narrative, and placed him at the center of a stage he never truly understood. Her confession, delivered with unnerving calm in a quiet interview room, was everything Miss Marple had predicted. Precise, deliberate, and free of remorse. She had destroyed the sash and hook the night of their recovery, entering the station through the back archive entrance with a copy of Reeves's old key, taken months ago under the pretense of restoring. A damaged filing cabinet, the ashes had been flushed. The metal hook dropped into the village canal. She had chosen Swan not only for his cruelty, but for his predictability. She knew his habits, his condescension, his willingness to dismiss. She'd known he wouldn't take Godfrey seriously. She knew exactly when to nudge Sarah into the shadows. She even scripted the confession Sarah had given, planting the right cues, using guilt as a lever. The plan had always been layered, misdirected, and theatrical. But despite the confessions and the evidence, one thing remained unresolved. Miss Marple sat with Reeves outside the theatre 2 days later, the front now shuttered, a for sale sign just placed in the lobby window. She won't serve time, Reeves said quietly, or not the way people expect. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Because she didn't kill anyone with her own hands. Because the Crown Prosecution Service says there's no proof she directed Godfrey to kill. Only that she encouraged, inspired. The difference between guidance and manipulation is thinner than the paper the verdict will be printed on. Miss Marple nodded unsurprised. Justice, she said, rarely wears the face we expect. Reeves sighed. And Godfrey, he'll be moved to a facility next week. Not prison either, psychiatric care. He doesn't need a cell, she said. He needs silence. They sat in the cool shade of the theatre's eaves, the distant clink of cafe spoons and church bells drifting through the square. Then, as if a thought had returned from somewhere long buried, Reeves turned toward her. Miss Marple, When did you know? She gave the smallest smile. Which part? Lavinia. That she wasn't who she claimed to be. She looked into the square for a moment, then answered. From the beginning, it was the way she spoke about the masks. Not the colour, the tone. She spoke about them with possessiveness, as though they were hers. And later, when we reviewed the box in the attic, it was she who opened it. She who laid the red mask out first. The others, blue, silver, were untouched. She chose the symbol. She directed the scene. Reeves frowned, but she said Godfrey took it. She let him. But even before that, it was her small details. The sash she claimed had gone missing weeks before the murder. That was never on the costume list. I checked it myself. She invented the memory, like an author adding a note to a character's wardrobe, something that would later appear as a clue. And Peter, Miss Marple's voice softened. He was the only innocent in the middle of it all, and they both used him differently. Godfrey saw himself in Peter, fragile, overlooked. Lavinia saw an echo of her own exclusion. Both wanted to shape him, neither saw him for who he was. Reeves tapped his notebook. Still, no one else saw any of it. Not Alice, not Clive. Because Lavinia never stood center stage, she said. She stitched things from the wings. She understood one thing better than anyone else in that building. Stories are more believable when the director stays invisible. Reeves fell quiet. Miss Marple stood gathering her things. The stage will reopen one day, she said. Not here, perhaps, but somewhere. It always does. And the ghosts, they find new scripts, she said gently. Or, if they're lucky, they rest. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She sat at the window with a book unopened in her lap, watching the dusk fall over the village rooftops. The theatre, for all its dust and drama, had always reflected more than stories. It reflected the people inside it, those who performed, those who listened, and those who watched from the shadows, always waiting for the right moment to step into the light. This case had never been about one villain. It had been about the echo of wounds left unhealed. About how silence, when nurtured with bitterness, becomes a script too powerful to resist. Lavinia had written that script. Godfrey had performed it. Swan had triggered it. And Peter had survived it. And Miss Marple, patient as ever, had read between the lines before anyone else knew there was a story to begin with. Outside, the wind rustled a loose theatre flyer down the road. She did not rise to collect it. The curtain had fallen, and this time it would not rise again. The next morning, the village of Lower Hambledon moved with its usual rhythm, as if the strange storm of theatre and tragedy had passed and left only puddles behind. The bakery queue returned. The paper boy made his rounds with folded headlines no longer bearing the names of murderers or missing boys, and the theatre, though boarded, was no longer the centre of every whispered conversation. It stood like a relic now, a building more silent than haunted. Miss Marple, walking along the main street with her gloves tucked neatly in her handbag, felt a familiar shift in the air. Not change exactly, but transition, the kind that often arrives after endings, the kind that rarely lasts. She had already declined a formal commendation from the parish council. Quietly, politely. She wasn't fond of spotlights, never had been. What mattered was that the right people had been seen, the wrong ones revealed, and those caught between the two had found some way forward. Peter especially. He'd returned to his part-time work at the bookshop, quiet but steady. He hadn't spoken much since Lavinia's arrest, and Miss Marple didn't press him. But a few days earlier, he'd stopped her in the square, eyes thoughtful, and asked, "If someone tells you who you were, do you have to believe them forever?" She'd told him no. That identity is not what others write into your script, but what you choose to keep when the curtain falls. He'd nodded and left it at that. Now, as she neared the churchyard path, she paused beside the parish notice board. Tucked among the advertisements for sewing circles and a missing tabby cat, there was a new flyer. Unremarkable at first glance. Pale blue paper, ink smudged slightly from the damp. It read, "Auditions, The Vicar's Mistake, Reimagined. All roles open, new voices welcome. No name listed, no venue confirmed, just a contact number. Local." Miss Marple tilted her head. She'd heard nothing of a new troupe forming. Alice Harmon, Sarah Denning and Clive had all stepped away quietly. From theatre matters, no one from the previous cast had mentioned revivals, and the building itself was still under legal review. She took out her notebook and copied the number. Not out of suspicion, yet, but because it struck her as too soon. The ink barely, dry on old wounds, and yet someone was ready to reopen the stage. That in itself wasn't unusual. But the choice of play, The Vicar's Mistake, carried a kind of irony too pointed to ignore. The same play that had been interrupted the night Swan died. A title that now felt more like commentary than coincidence. She walked a few more paces, then turned down the narrow lane that wound behind the old theatre. Here the walls still bore faint traces of the posters torn down after the closure. Graffiti hadn't found it yet, only moss, and a slight film of mildew on the bricks. She paused. Near the rear door, rusted shut, long disused. It was locked, undisturbed, but in the gravel near the step, her eyes caught something odd. A small square of cardboard, damp at the edges, a torn corner of a script page, stage direction, faded but legible. Spotlight rises. Character A mimics. Character B's movement, perfectly unnervingly. Character B falters. She turned it over. No handwriting, no signature, just the edge of a name partially torn, Avinia. It didn't make sense. All copies of the old production script had been accounted for and boxed. Nothing had been signed. Nothing should have been under this door unless it had been slipped there recently. After the theatre had closed, Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. Later that evening she brought the fragment to Reeves. He read it twice, 3 times before speaking. "You think someone else was involved?" "Another accomplice, I think," she said slowly. "That Lavinia planned far more than we uncovered. I think Godfrey may have been one mask, but I'm beginning to wonder if there was another." Reeves frowned. "You think she had a backup plan?" "Perhaps not a plan," she said, "but a legacy, someone to carry on the story. Maybe not in violence. Maybe just in narrative." Reeves looked uneasy. "A copycat? Or an apprentice?" They filed a quiet report, logged the flyer and the paper fragment, but there was no immediate trail. The phone number listed on the flyer rang. To voicemail, no identifying message. Just music. Old theatre organ music, warped by poor recording. Miss Marple kept the flyer. The theatre remained sealed, but someone had already begun writing again. Rehearsing. And as she walked home that night, Miss Marple passed the bookshop, where Peter was closing up. He looked up from the window, caught her eye, and gave the faintest nod. He looked older now. Not by years, but by understanding. She returned the nod, but her thoughts remained on the paper tucked into her pocket. There were always scripts unfinished, always people who didn't know how to leave the stage. And though this performance had ended, the curtain, she suspected, had only been drawn back slightly, enough to let the next mystery in.